Let's turn now to the third thesis of political naturalism, the claim that the city-state is prior to the individual. This claim is probably the most difficult of the three claims to adequately understand, and it's the most liable to misunderstanding. Everything hinges on what exactly is meant by prior. The city-state is prior to the individual. What exactly does that mean? And what we're going to see is the key to unlocking Aristotle's idea here is getting clear on what sense of prior is he's using here. Now, to kind of wipe away some misconceptions at the start, when you see a claim like that, the city-state, the state, the political community is prior to the individual, that might make you think like, oh man, he's saying, the state is more important than the individual. Like individuals might need to be like sacrificed for the state, that the state takes a kind of precedence over the individual. And that seems like, a kind of proto-fascistic or nationalistic, kind of sketchy view of politics. Is that what Aristotle's getting at? That doesn't seem very good. That's not what Aristotle means. He is not claiming anything like that when he says that the city-state is prior to the individual. Another way that we might understand it that's mistaken, natural way to understand it, however, is in time. Usually when we say things are prior, we mean in time. If we don't mean in importance, if we don't mean like it's more important than, maybe we mean it's before. The city-state is prior in time to the individual. That's not what Aristotle means. And you can see that he wouldn't, it'd make nonsense of his views if that's what he meant, because he just gave us that whole genealogy, right? And the city-state's way over at one end, and you have all these other communities, and you have the individuals still running around existing prior to the existence of a city-state. And so, no, the individual is prior in time to the city-state. Right. And so when he says that the city-state is prior to the individual, he has to have something else in mind. He can't be meaning like in importance or something like that. He can't be meaning in time, because that's just obviously false. So what exactly does he mean? Aristotle, in another work called the Metaphysics, he has a dictionary of philosophic terms. And one of them is prior, and he lists out a bunch of different senses of prior. And I'm not going to go through them all. One of them is in time, right? That's a sense of prior. But the one that he's using here is not the temporal one. It's not the temporal sense of priority. It's what he in this other work calls priority in completeness. The city-state is prior in completeness to the individual. Well, okay, so we got a word there now, but I don't know what that means. Aristotle actually illustrates this, and this is Aristotle. This is how Aristotle actually indicates that this is the sense of priority that he's concerned with. He gives an analogy of, he says, in the same way that the whole is prior to the parts, or whatever, right? And he doesn't spell it out or anything, but he says, I like that. And if you go read this other work, the Metaphysics, where he's got this dictionary of philosophic terms, it's clear prior and completeness. That's the sense in which the whole is prior to the parts. And so that's the sense of priority that's at issue here. Here's an example. Here's another thing Aristotle would say. He would say that the house is prior in completeness to the bricks, the floor joists, the windows, and everything else that makes up a house, the nails and whatever else you like, right? All the other things that make up the house. Those other things are clearly prior in time to the house, right? You can't make a house unless you first have bricks and floor joists and windows and nails and so on. You take all those things, you get them all, and then you put them together to make the house. And so the house comes into existence at a later time, right? So the house is, so the parts of the house, the bricks, the boards and so on, are prior in time to the house, but the house is prior in completeness to those parts. Okay, in the same way that the whole is prior to the part. Spell it out a little bit further. What's the idea here? What he thinks is that the parts of a whole can't really do what they're supposed to do unless they are in that whole. So, for example, take the floor joists, right? That's a part of the house. Floor joists are the pieces of wood that hold up the floor, right? Your floor is not just floating there, it's held up by these big, long, huge pieces of wood that then are attached to the foundation or whatever. And so their function, the function of a floor joist, is to hold up the floor so that you can walk in. The house has a floor and you can walk around in it. Yeah. Well, look, floor joists can't perform their function. They can't do what floor joists are supposed to do unless they are a part of a house, unless they are a part of that whole. And one of the things that this implies for Aristotle is that you can't really understand what a floor joist is unless you understand what houses are and how floor joists are parts of houses. You can't understand a part of a house unless you understand what a house is and what the function of a house is and how floor joists help do that, help the house perform its function. Right? So floor joists the parts of a house can't perform their functions unless they're part of the house. And we can't even understand the parts of a thing unless we understand the whole of which they are a part. That's all that Aristotle means when he talks about prior incompleteness, or I should say that's all. That's what he means. Right? It's not the standard sense of priority. It's not any sense that we would typically assign to priority. It's a kind of specialized sense, but that's what he's talking about here. So his idea is that the city-state is prior to the individual in the exact same way that the house is prior to its floor joists. The human being cannot perform its function well. And what is it to perform? What is it for a human being to perform its function well? That's what it is for a human being to live a good life, to live well, to flourish, to be happy. That's what happiness is, eudaimonia, right? It's performing the function well. And to perform a function well, you got to perform with virtue, yada, yada, yada. We went over all that, right? So the human being cannot perform its function well outside of a political community. That's what Aristotle means to be saying when he says the city-state is prior to the individual. The human being cannot fully perform its function well outside of a political community. Let's talk about that. First, to try to get you a sense of what he might do or why he might think this is true, what he's kind of getting at. Again, consider an analogy. Another kind of political animal that I'd mentioned in a previous video was a bee. Aristotle thinks bees are political animals. And he would say much the same thing about bees and beehives as he's saying here about human beings and city-states. Aristotle would be happy to say that the bee cannot fully perform its function well outside of a hive. A bee cannot live a good bee life, flourish as a bee, unless it's integrated into a hive. And if you think about it for 2 seconds, it seems to make a lot of sense. Let's say you were to take some bee out of a hive, hopefully you're wearing gloves or whatever, and bees have this uncanny sense of being able to find their hive. I don't know. You isolate it somewhere, right? You make it so it can't go back to its hive. Right? You put it in your room. I don't know. It's probably not a good idea. But that bee that you've now put in your room that you've isolated from its hive can't live a good bee life. It's not going to be able to do the kinds of things that bees are supposed to do. It's not going to be able to go visit flowers and make honey and sting kids and whatever else bees are supposed to be doing. It's not going to be able to do any of those things, right? Because it's outside the hive. In order to flourish as a bee, it's got to have its own place in the hive. It's got to be, it's I don't know, there are drones and workers, I think, and then the queen bee. Right? There are those three kinds of bees. In order to flourish, the drone bee has to do the things that the drones are supposed to be doing. The worker bee has to do the things that the worker bee is supposed to be doing. And when you isolate them from the hive, they can't. Aristotle is saying there's something similar going on with human beings. When you isolate a human being, if a human being somehow becomes isolated from a political community, they're not going to be able to flourish. They're not going to be able to live good lives, flourishing, happy lives. Well, why not? Well, so what, fine for bees or whatever. I don't care about bees. What are human beings? Why can't human beings live a good life? I don't know. I got an uncle and he lives off in the middle of nowhere and he seems happy enough. And so why can't human beings live well outside of political community? Well, so the first thing to note here is that your uncle or whoever who lives out in the middle of nowhere, they're not really isolated from the political community. They still go shop at wherever the local Target, or I don't know, I think Walmart's more prevalent in rural communities. Your uncle still goes and buys his food over at the store. He's still maybe, I don't know, right? Maybe he's connected into the grid. Who knows? I don't know, right? There's still interaction there. And that's not really what Aristotle's talking about when he's talking about someone outside of a political community. He's talking about someone who has no interaction like that. They don't go to the store. They don't draw power from the electric grid. They don't have workers come out to dig them a well or anything, like totally, completely, 100% isolated and order clothes on Amazon or anything like that. That's what it is to be isolated from the political community. That's the analog to taking the bee into your room. Someone like that, they are going to spend all of their time just trying to survive, right? They will have no time to devote to pretty much anything else, just survival. The household, we were talking about the household, that was pretty bad. You spend a lot of time just seeing to your everyday needs. Well, if you're just a lone individual, it's going to be even worse. You spend 18 hours a day making sure you don't die. Now, okay, so even at that level of description, you might say, yeah, that's not really a flourishing human life. That's not how I want to live. That doesn't seem particularly good. But we can flesh it out with more of Aristotle's theory. Your capacities, your human capacities, your rational capacities, right? Those are our distinctly human capacities, according to Aristotle, are going to go undeveloped. If you spend 18 hours a day, staving off death, your rational capacities are going to go underdeveloped. And one particularly clear way in which this is true, you are not going to be able to develop your mind. And I mentioned this in a previous video. Aristotle thinks that in order to live truly flourishing, fully human lives, we need a certain amount of leisure time. We need a certain amount of time, that's not devoted to staving off death, to getting food and clothes and so on. We need a certain amount of time where we don't have to worry about those kinds of things. And so we can develop our minds simply for the sake of developing our minds. We can think about things. We can investigate things scientifically. We can think about math, whatever, things like that. Those kinds of activities, Aristotle thinks, are essential to human happiness. They're kind of the height of human happiness, Aristotle thinks, this life of the mind. And you can't engage in that kind of thing if you're spending 18 hours a day staving off death, right? And so outside of a political community, you're not going to be able to flourish. You're not going to have the leisure time. That's one thing Aristotle means. Another way we can get at the idea. Aristotle also thinks that happiness, virtuous rational activity, some of the other virtues are things like generosity and justice, which we've looked at. Outside of a political community, there is no opportunity to engage in those kinds of activities. You can't be generous if you're not interacting with people. You can't be just if you're not interacting with people. Justice, in Aristotle's view, is virtue as it relates to others. It's our characters as it relates to others. And you're not relating to anybody else if you're by yourself, if you're outside the political community. And so your occasions for exercising the virtues, for developing and exercising the virtues, because Aristotle thinks that we acquire the virtues by acting on them. So your occasions for acting on, developing, and acquiring the virtues are minimal at best if you're outside of a political community. You simply won't be able to do it. And so you won't really be able to achieve a flourishing human life. You won't be able to engage in virtuous, rational activity if you are separated from a political community. That's what Aristotle is getting at when he says the city-state is prior to the individual. Now, a kind of nice, often quoted statement of Aristotle's that doesn't quite sum up entirely Aristotle's political naturalism, but does a pretty good job of it, is the following. So Aristotle in Book 1, Chapter 2, kind of towards the end, says the following. Anyone who cannot form a community with others. And so what he means here, cannot, doesn't have the capacity to, cannot form a community with others. Or who does not need to because he is self-sufficient. He doesn't need anybody else. He can live a good life without other people. Anybody like that who can't form a community or doesn't need to form a community is no part of a city-state. He is either a beast or a god, which is to say, not a human being. Human beings are essentially political animals. And if you don't have any capacity or desire or natural impulse for communal or social living, well, you're not a human being. Maybe you're a beast. Tigers don't live in packs. Tigers are asocial animals. Maybe you're like a tiger, right? A beast. But maybe that's not it. Maybe you're able to provide everything for yourself. You're totally self-sufficient just in yourself. I don't know. That's kind of what a god is like, according to Aristotle. The gods are totally self-sufficient. They don't need community to see to their needs, to flourish, to achieve happiness, to engage in the life of the mind. They don't need anybody else. And so if you are able to flourish, to achieve eudaimonia, to engage in these kinds of virtuous, rational activities without the assistance of a political community, without being in a political community, well, then you must be a god, because that is beyond human ability. That's his claim, right? And so I think you can see in a certain way, at least how this idea that the city-state is prior to the individual and this idea that the human being is a political animal inform this idea that Aristotle is getting at here.